So thank you all again. I'll say this online for coming on at 3 o'clock today. We appreciate that. And I'm very pleased to introduce Mary E. Hunt, PhD, who is co-director of the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual, which is WATER, W-A-T-E-R. I think that's ingenious. Along with her partner, Diane New, saying that right? New? Mary started WATER in 1983. Diane, her partner, is a therapist and spiritual director, as well as the person who leads their efforts in liturgy and ritual, but she will not be able to join us today. As Catholics by tradition, they are not ordained, so not clergy, which is what I had originally thought, but what do I know? I'm Jewish. Mary will say something about her background and work, what WATER does and why they do it, and offer a general sense of women's studies in religion. And as I've just mentioned to her, it will be Mary's show for anywhere from a half hour to an hour, depending on how much she wants to say. And then we'll do what we usually do, which is open this up to Q&A. And I will, as I usually do, be monitoring the chat. So if you'd like, feel free to put questions and comments in the chat. Mary, do you want me to hold the chat comments until you finish presenting, or would you like this to be interactive if people have questions along the way? What's better for you?
Well, let's see how we do, Ellen, and we might mix it up a little bit.
Sure, fair enough. Okay, so it's all yours.
Well, thank you. What a pleasure. Ellen, thank you for this very kind invitation. The Contemporary Gender Roles Shared Interest Group, I think, is typical of so many that have developed over the years. And these groups provide people with places to discuss important issues, and no less so in your group. While seemingly narrow in focus, I think history has proved that how gender roles are constructed, which is one of your main foci, has had a deep impact on the broader culture. One has only to look at the current presidential election in all of its complexity to realize that the broadest binary categories of women and men, not to mention black and white, which are, in my view, integral aspects of any gender analysis, play key roles. There's no doubt about it. I want to begin with a special thanks to John Kidd, who had this idea of our being in conversation, of my being invited to join your group today. John and I were students together at Harvard Divinity School in the early 1970s. And I like to think, John, that we went there right from kindergarten, but apparently not. I have followed your ministry with appreciation when you were here in Washington, and I certainly admire your current work on language and liturgy, which is bearing fruit in much wider circles even than the Lutheran Church. Harvard Divinity School in our day, the early 70s, was what we mostly called white male and Yale, young men preparing for ministry in mainline Protestant denominations. I was actually part of the first sizable cohort of women students, including some Catholic women. That was also a switch. And as you can imagine, our presence as women was received variously. But the excellent dean at Harvard Divinity School, Krister Stendahl, who later became the Church of Sweden Bishop of Stockholm, understood equality. I think his wife, Britta Stendahl, who was a great scholar, had no small part in his education. We called him Sister Krister because he was the dean, which is the president, during the heady days when women taught professors how to use inclusive language. The theologian Harvey Cox was said to have been thrown M&Ms every time he switched mankind to humankind in his lectures. We'd throw him an M&M. That may be an apocryphal story, but I like it. And when women began at the same time to expect women professors as well as men, Harvard Divinity School began to change. It took some time, but John, I looked this up. Now 54% of the students at Harvard Divinity School are women. 10% are people who do not report in gender binary terms, so there may in fact be more women-identified persons even than that. 41% of what used to be an almost lily-white divinity school are now students of color. And there are 35 different religious affiliations. I think that's enormous progress, and it parallels much of the work that I've been involved in for the last 40 years. And I'd like to talk about that work with you today, if that's what you're interested in. Of course, what you're interested in will dictate what I talk about, but that's what I have prepared to talk about. I also want to begin by saying that another major influence in my life at Harvard Divinity School, other than the school itself, was the people. And one of them, and I know several of our folks here are Jewish, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on the Christian, but I want to begin with the name Judith Plaskow, because last month I was up in upstate New York, and I stopped at the Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls, and Judith Plaskow, who is the most important Jewish feminist theologian of my experience, is now inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. And she's really the first person in our kind of progressive religion who has been inducted. There, of course, early folks from the suffrage movement and so forth. But I just want to mention the name Judith Plaskow. If you're not familiar with her, that you would become familiar with her. And if you are, you would know the esteem in which she is held by her colleagues. We'll be having a special celebration of her at the American Academy of Religion this year. So I name her as one of the major figures in the work of feminist theology. What I want to propose this afternoon is that we break this up into 4 parts. The first is I want to give you a minute to just say who you are to yourself, at least, if we don't all introduce ourselves, and what questions you bring to our conversation. So just take a minute to do that, to think about who you are coming into the conversation and the questions that you bring, what you will be very disappointed or not be able to sleep about tonight if you don't discuss them. The second thing I'm going to do is talk about who I am and why I work as a feminist theologian. The third thing is going to be a kind of broad overview of how the field has grown in the last 50 years, and that's going to be painting with a roller, not a wide brush. And then I'll conclude with what I think are some of the things to which we're headed in the future. So that's going to be a grounding for what I hope will be a very broad-ranging Q&A. We can work until 4:45. It sounds like someone has a car pickup at 4:45, or until we run out of steam, or whichever comes first. So again, my thanks for the invitation, Ellen. My delight at being together. John, I'm so happy to see you. And I only wish I were there in person. Ironically, I spent this past weekend in Saratoga Springs, New York, a scant 70 miles from you, one of my favorite places, enjoying that beautiful late summer weather that we enjoyed over the weekend, and the beauty of the leaves beginning to change. We had everything from swimming to apple picking, so it was kind of that bridging of the seasons. The rain here today, I think, is heading your way, so I hope you really got out and enjoyed the weekend. So with that introduction, just maybe we can just even go around ever so quickly in terms of who you are, just a sentence about you. I'm John Kidd, and I'm a retired minister. John, you're done. And then other people can pick up from there. And then it'll give me a sense of who we are. And then take the minute before we do that to write down your most pressing questions, or what you'd like to come away from this time with and say, boy, I really got some new ideas on that, or I really thought differently about that, or just give yourself a minute to do that. And then we'll go to intros. How's that sound?
Okay.
Okay. Yep. So just take a minute. If I do not discuss X, I will be disappointed. I'll be discussing it over dinner and wishing I had brought it up in the group. Everybody got something? Little snippet of something? And then if you want, you don't have to introduce yourself, but if you want, at least 3 or 4 people so I could get a feel for who's here. That would be a great way to start.
Okay, well,
yes. Let's start with Deborah, go to Catherine, and go from there.
Okay, if you want to do it now, just so everyone knows, I muted all of you with the exception of Mary, because I wanted to make sure there were no extraneous noises, especially as she started her talk. So I'm sorry if that complicates things, but you'll have to unmute yourselves.
Okay, go ahead. Deborah, you want to be first, and then Catherine Burnett?
Okay.
Deborah's still trying to unmute
Catherine,
herself.
why don't you go ahead, just in the interest of time. Why don't you go ahead, Catherine Burnett? Deborah, don't worry. Catherine, go ahead.
Why don't I go ahead?
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Catherine Burnett. I'm married to an Episcopal priest, and as most of you know, we elected our first presiding bishop, a woman, back in '96. and that was very, very exciting, and took the Anglican Church by surprise. Not really, but anyway. My question is, we keep on seeing lots of women bishops, and we seem to be on a trend to have almost more women in the role of bishop. Are we going to keep on seeing that trend? We certainly see it as we're electing new rectors to churches and that sort of thing.
Thank you. We just happen to have a program on that coming up next Wednesday, so you may want to join us. We have a bishop, an ordinand from 50 years ago, the author of the book and the producer of the movie coming up next week on the Episcopal women's ordination. So I'll get you more information. Anybody else would like to introduce themselves, please go ahead. John, that includes you. I didn't mean to cut you off, my dear. That was just an example.
Before anyone else, Deborah, it looked like you had.
Yeah, Deborah, you're.
Had unmuted. It looks like you had, but now it looks like you can. It looks like you're muted again. So I don't know what you did after what you did, but I'm just keeping an eye on where I see that you're muted. So try to undo.
Let's try Nancy in the meantime. Nancy?
I hope I'm an older lady that wants to have an inquiring mind. And I was formerly a veterinarian, but I know John Kidd is more than a minister. So I belong to several ollies because I want to know what's going on all over the United States and what people are thinking.
Great. Thanks so much. Deborah, you're unmuted.
Yes, I should be unmuted. All right. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfectly.
First, I want to tell you that my son, who is a rabbi in Ann Arbor, graduated from Harvard Divinity also. And John knows that because they followed the same path, Princeton, Harvard. My husband and I founded a new Jewish congregation in Philadelphia in about 1968, 70. And by 71, we had already established, it was independent. We didn't have to join the conservative movement, the reform movement, and whatever. He was also professor of ancient Near East at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, which he also helped to found around the same time. He was very busy at all with these two jobs. He only had a month off in the summer. But that was a long time ago, and his rabbis that he's already taught, and they've already retired. We're in our 90s now. And they're all calling him and writing letters of how much they learned from him and how much they appreciate him. So, but the first thing we did was establish equality for women. And we also hired a gay cantor. It was a very important role in the Jewish service. He chants most of the prayers. And we had some friction with members of the board and so on. And those who didn't like our changes left, and we were all glad they did. And from then on, it was equality. At the Rabbinical College, they were the first, no, the Reform movement was the first movement to hire to graduate a gay student, a woman student. And now it graduates, many years later. A few years later, we graduated gay people, and we had gay rabbis. And our most famous gay rabbi has a very large congregation in New York, and she's quite famous. And she's been on many TV programs speaking for feminists and women. So I myself have been a feminist since I was a child. I had a feminist grandmother, and she taught me, you make sure you vote. I worked very hard for those votes for women. And I really appreciate her. Since I was 11 years old, I heard this, so I have to acknowledge her. Thank you. I've told you enough about myself, and I also helped to found this contemporary Changing Roles. And so glad to hand it over to Ellen, who's doing a magnificent job.
Thank you. Yes, I read your name in the materials, and thank you for founding it. John, why don't we go to you, and then we'll maybe move along. So we've just got a snippet here from some people.
Particularly since before retirement, I've been very interested in the language, and in particular language of liturgy. And I'm frustrated because I mean, there are only about 4 or 5 terms that are really gender specific, heavily male. I owe you, Mary, for even trying to find how to speak about God, or I'm playing with that because you say the word God and instantly it's a male image that comes to mind. But the question, how do we unburden ourselves from the sexist language and incorporate more inclusive or at least neutral language that embraces the full spectrum of sexuality in our work? And as a church person, it's for somebody who spent 40 years in church ministry, I get very frustrated being locked into the idea that both the biblical and the liturgical language is stuck in 1611 when the King James translation came along. And
God stopped speaking all of a sudden.
there isn't a collective will to change that I can see. So how do you instigate that? I know you're working on that and all that, but how do we do it more broadly so it can get into the hinterlands?
And
Yeah.
by the way, John did do a session for us on the vocabulary, gendered vocabulary in the Bible.
Yes, he did.
So, and by the way, Mary, don't feel bad. We'll have you back anytime you want, and you can stay at my house, and it doesn't even have to be to do a presentation for the SIG. So there you are.
Thank you.
Enjoy
Yeah, I love your area. I love the Lee Lennox Pittsfield, that whole section.
Oh, good. Come and visit us too.
Yeah.
Well, we
Mary.
may have to bring you down to the foreign country of Sandusfield, which is South County, but we're beautiful down there too. So.
Well, my sister lives in Saratoga, so that's why it's my one of my stomping grounds.
Sure.
And Mary, it's Kate Kidd.
Yeah, Kate, hi.
Hi, good to see you.
Nice to see you.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions, which are a little bit different than what's been raised so far. And so one thing that I see as a person who attends HGS activities with John, who has been involved with the Lutheran Church at the national level, that it seems like theologians are working well together in an interfaith context, educators talking about what's happening. But I don't feel like that's filtering down to the parish level. And my perception could be wrong. But what are the things that you have found to be most effective in promoting interfaith and ecumenical dialogue? And how do you think we can make these conversations more fruitful, especially for just lay people who are attending church?
Great. I hope
you.
we can touch on that. Thanks. Good to see you. Wonderful. Thank you. And the others, I hope I'll get to hear something from you at a later point, but it's really great to have this, just even this much of an opening as to who's who and what's what. I want to talk a little bit about who I am and why I work as a feminist theologian. This is sort of, dial a theologian time, but just to give you a kind of a personal story, I was born and raised as a cradle Irish Catholic on Tipperary Hill in Syracuse, New York in the 1950s. That tells you about all you need to know. At Tip Hill, if you've never heard of it, is the section of Syracuse where the Irish who dug the Erie Canal lived. It's also the only place in the United States where there's a traffic light that has the green light on the top and the red light on the bottom. And the reason for that is, and it's legal, you're not misseeing it, it's legal. Because when the Irish lads saw that the red and the orange were above the green, they took great offense. And they also took rocks, and they threw the rocks at the light until the light went out. And it became cheaper and easier to simply pass a law that it was okay to have one traffic light fixture in the country where the green light was on the top and the red and yellow were on the bottom. So that's the kind of ethnic Irish that I come from. We moved out of that neighborhood to another one shortly after my birth, but that's where my family started. And it was the post-war period. We were boomers, now we are boomers. The economy was expanding, education was expected. My mother was a teacher, my father was a salesman and a real estate investor. They were part of that upward mobility of Catholics and post-war veterans and so forth, who in an expanding economy were able to do quite well. I went to public schools in the grades, and then I went to Catholic schools, and I went to a Catholic high school where I was introduced to urban poverty, to Native American reservation life, to rural poverty in Kentucky, thanks to the Franciscan nuns who trotted us off to these places to do good work. It was an eye-opener for me as a white middle-class kid from a modest city. It was an eye-opener to see what the lifestyle and the experiences of people very unlike me were. And it has stayed with me my entire life. I went to college at Marquette University during the anti-Vietnam War years, the civil rights time, the assassinations of the various Kennedys and Dr. Martin Luther King, when the man went on the moon, when there was Woodstock, when there was a rapidly globalizing world through technology, rudimentary as it was in those days. And I noticed, of course, that women and men were treated differently. Women could not get our own credit cards without our husbands signing on for us until 1974.
That's right.
The Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed. And that was the year that I graduated from Harvard Divinity School. That's rather shocking when you think about it. At Harvard Divinity School, I saw not only the white male and Yale faculty, as we referred to them, but I saw Rosemary Radford Ruther, who was a Catholic woman with 3 children. She had a 1-year audition, as it were, for the Stillman Chair, which was the chair in Catholic Studies. It was, in her case, a folding chair. She did not continue to be employed at Harvard after that. She was beginning to do what I think was some of the most foundational and important work in feminist theology, Rosemary Radford Ruther. At the same time, and this, again, John, some of this is familiar to you, there was an Uruguayan Jesuit priest by the name of Juan Luis Segundo, who was at Harvard Divinity School teaching for a year. Juan Luis Segundo, and he was teaching liberation theology from Latin America. And I saw both Rosemary and Juan Luis marginalized at Harvard Divinity School for reasons of discrimination, gender and ethnic. And I think we were all the worse off for their being short-term faculty members. They were what we would call today diversity. And it didn't happen. At the same time, the Catholic feminist theologian, and I'm going to focus my remarks, and I said this at the outset, I'm going to focus my remarks on the Christian world, but I will be happy to talk more about Judaism and other traditions as well later on. But the Catholic feminist theologian Mary Daly was teaching at Boston College in those days. And if you take one name away from all this, Mary Daly, D-A-L-Y, is the name to take. In 1973, when we were at Harvard, John, she wrote Beyond God the Father. And I would say if one book changed the world from the feminist theological perspective, it was Beyond God the Father. She basically said, and I'm going to put it in, just a couple of words, if God is male, then the male is God. If God is male, then the male is God.
Yeah, it's true.
That's the key insight. That's the one that launched the ship that we call feminist theology. At Harvard, we learned that God was that then, that nothing greater could be conceived, the ground of being, the ground of possibility. We learned about divine versus human, the be all, the end all, the highest power, whatever you called it. But however it cashed out, studies showed then and now that if you ask a bunch of children, just random children on the street in an American city, what God looks like, because that's a very hard concept. God is a hard concept to get. They'd say Santa Claus more often than not. So if the divine is gendered, which I don't think is a very helpful way to go, in other words, I'm not a mother goddess sort, then I think it's the gendered thing that structures society. It was Heraclitus, the great Greek philosopher, who said if dogs and cats and cows and pigs had gods and goddesses, guess what? They would look like dogs and cats and cows and pigs, because divinity is constructed by others. But how it's constructed reflects those who have power. So the traditional notions of the divine as omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent are not the dreams of the immigrant woman who doesn't have breakfast for her kids, but they're the next step for those who have everything and need nothing. If you've got a lot, if you've got power, you want all of it. If you've got knowledge, you want all of it. If you're a big presence in the world, you want to be the whole enchilada. And that's not how people who have nothing think and feel It's how people who have a lot think and feel. So that was really very formative for me in terms of understanding theology, that, golly, not only were theologians treated badly because of who they were, but some of the ideas that I had been fed really didn't hold water after a while. And then, of course, came the women's movements. Good heavens, where to begin? No area of life was untouched for us vis-a-vis women's issues, whether it was family or sports. Did you hear today that Billie Jean King will be getting the Congressional Gold Medal for her life's work for equality? That was just announced today. So I jumped, and politics, of course. And so if all of these, why not religion? So in 1974, I left Harvard Divinity School with a master's, and to the consternation of poor Krister Stendahl, who told people, "What, Mary didn't even apply here. What's going on? What's the matter with her?" And I went on to Berkeley, jumping into the heart of the women's movement on the West, or what we call the left coast. Sexuality was an important part of the mix, whether birth control, abortion, or same-sex love. Much of what we had been taught in the 50s and 60s about what and who women are, what men are, were all up for discussion, for experimentation, and for new ways of living in healthy, holistic patterns. And I dare say that the West Coast was quite far ahead of Boston, where I had come from on these matters. It was really a different place. It was quite common as a 20-something woman to love and to be sexually active with women. I did, and I do. It was expected that heterosexually active women would use birth control and have abortions. Roe, of course, was decided in 73. They would marry or not as they pleased. But most of this so-called sexual revolution or sexual liberation applied to white, especially to educated women like me, not to poor, young women of color. Feminism in those days was long on good concepts, but short on seeing how very differently women-identified persons experienced the various forms of discrimination that we now call an intersectional analysis. So we didn't have all the pieces put together, but we knew somehow that how it worked for people who looked like me, who had my pedigree and education. We had a hard time in certain arenas, but it was nothing compared to how poor and young and women of color were experiencing the world. So we have grown in our feminism, and our feminism has grown with us. And I'm very happy about that, because I think that it's honest and it's authentic. I went on to graduate studies, of course, in Berkeley. The Graduate Theological Union, which poor Krister Stendahl despaired of that I wasn't at Harvard, was made up of 9 seminaries, from Baptist to Jesuit, from Lutheran to Unitarian, with centers dealing with issues of women's oppression, Black oppression, ecological concerns very early on. And I turned my Rosemary Redford Ruther Juan Luis Segundo insight into a study, eventually a dissertation, on what I called feminist liberation theology. I looked at what had happened with women in theology from the 1850s to 1978 or 79 in this country. And I looked at how liberation theology had developed in Latin America throughout the 60s, the 70s. And my conclusion was that the development of method in construction was the most important thing. What does that mean? It sounds like a disease, the method of construction. It meant that how we create theology, who's involved, where they live, what language they speak, whether they're a lay person or a clergy person, these things make all the difference in the world in the theology and the theological views that they express. I also learned that there was a pecking order in theology, from philosophical and systematic theology, which is what I studied, which was on the top along with biblical studies, to what was on the bottom, namely pastoral or applied theology, like preaching and liturgy. Those are kind of the leftovers. Those were at the bottom. Exactly the inverse of how people experience religion. What people want from religion, I think, is community, ministry, and meaning in that order.
Yeah.
When the baby dies, or a mother gets sick, or a cat gets stuck in a tree, we want a community to help. And we want someone to pay attention, which is what ministers do. And only much later, if at all, if time allows, do we wonder why. Community, ministry, meaning. And the theological training and the theological world has that absolutely upside down. as if the meaning questions were first, and the attention to people were a little bit left over. So I mastered the academic aspect of religion, but I realized that liberation theology especially was praxis or practice-based in the real world with real people. I had also noticed at Harvard, then at Berkeley, that many of my female classmates were going on to be ordained. Imagine, I thought, they're going to have jobs. Some of them will rise up in the ranks of their denominations. How strange is that? The Catholic Church did not and does not licitly ordain women, though there are now Roman Catholic women priests who are ordained validly, that is, by a bishop in apostolic succession, but not licitly. That is, they're ordained against the institutional church's wishes. And they are instantaneously excommunicated upon being ordained through the Roman Catholic Women Church organization. And but I get ahead of my story here. That's an important thing to know, that those changes that took place over the last 50 years in most Protestant, and certainly most Protestant denominations, and certainly in most, perhaps not in Orthodox Judaism, but even little, Blue Greenberg, help me, even in Orthodox Judaism, there are people who have made changes. But certainly in Reformed Judaism and Reconstructionists, there have been major changes.
Right.
So I decided, in my infinite wisdom at the age of 24 or 25, whatever I was, that in addition to doing a doctorate, I would also do a Master of Divinity at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley for ordination, to get the training, but also to prove that the only reason women were not ordained in the Catholic Church was because of discrimination, not because of ability. It wasn't like we couldn't do it. Theology is not rocket science. It was not for me a heavy lift to do an MDiv, shall we say. I laugh when I hear people talk about the rigors of Jesuit preparation. Well, guess what? Jesuits, they're called the intellectual elite of Catholics, and other such promotion that they put out with their elite and rigorous training. Well, guess what? We women did the same thing, and in many cases more. Jesuits don't necessarily have a doctorate, and we had the pleasure of paying for it. It was the proverbial, she did it in high heels and backwards in the academic field. You know that expression of Ginger Rogers, that she was doing everything Fred Astaire did, but in high heels and backwards. We did that in the theological world. The economic aspect of my training caused my good businessman father to take notice of discrimination. He couldn't figure out why the men got a free ride for tuition, room and board, Jesuit affirmative action programs for jobs once they got through. Women had to take out student loans, and we had no guaranteed employment whatsoever. And so it was. So I finished all that in 1980, and I was invited to be something called a frontier intern, which is a wonderful phrase. It was a program that started in the Methodist Church of the Presbyterian Church of the U.S., but it was a rapidly globalizing program that aimed at so-called creative young Christians who would be prepared to be future religious leaders, especially ecumenical leaders, which goes to one of the questions that was being raised. What about ecumenical work? And it was, they took about a dozen people around the world each year and sent them to places where the Protestant churches essentially didn't have missioners. And instead of going with your steamer trunks, or in the case of one Swedish colleague of mine, literally a ship brought over his Swedish modern furniture to Argentina, so he'd be quite at home. We went with a suitcase or two. I actually used the money to type my dissertation. I used the extra baggage allowance money to type my dissertation, I think. So it was a really edgy program. And it was a wonderful program. It was called we called it the Kindergarten for the World Council of Churches. It was kind of mainline Protestant, excellent program. Some of our frontier interns went on to become, for example, the head of the World Council of Churches. We also called the World Council of Churches the rest home for old frontier interns. So it was just a marvelous experience of international, ecumenical, interreligious forms of being together in mission. And I assured the organizers that as a Catholic, I was in no danger of becoming a religious leader. So they perhaps didn't want to waste one of their dozen slots on me. No, they said, it's time for a Catholic. And so off I went to Argentina, clueless but game, in 1980. Now, Argentina in 1980 was in the midst of a dirty war, what was called the Dirty War, the military uprising, and then the killing of many, many people some of whom were thrown out of airplanes. An outsized percentage of Jews were killed during that time, much larger than their percentage in the population. I was sent to ECDET to teach liberation theology where it was done. So I really went there to learn. And I worked with Posse Justicia, which is the peace and justice service that Adolfo Pérez Esquivel founded and got a Nobel Peace Prize for. We marched with the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, whose children had disappeared.
Right.
I was terrified when our seminary was firebombed on November 22nd, 1980. We lost many books, but we didn't lose any of the kids who lived in that section of the seminary because their father was the librarian. I met Argentine feminists who were fascinated by the notion of feminist theology, as fascinated as I was by their work on popular women saints, outlawed by the government because they were competition to the Virgin Mary. It's one of my favorite popular religion stories. I learned and I loved these women's photography and their music. They were enormously well-educated and well-trained. I loved their literature. I loved their food. I enjoyed their wine. I took on a whole new dimension of life in Spanish language, and 2 years as an expat in a country under a dictatorship disabused me of any notions of elite privilege and vegetarianism that I had learned in Berkeley. So it was a marvelous experience. I love Argentina. I developed a deep love for Latin America. I've been back many, many times since and done lots of work with women's groups there over the last 40 years. When I returned to the US after 2 years of this international work and doing some travel for Frontier Intern to vet some other people and to make some connections and do some teaching, the prospect for me of teaching theology at Our Lady of the Snowdrop or some similar tame Catholic college was not all that enticing. That was a good thing because I was not in any demand. As an out lesbian who was pro-choice, pick your poison, I was persona non grata in many, many Catholic spaces. But at a memorable party of Network, have you heard of Network, the Catholic Social Justice Lobby, the Nuns on the Bus? Have you seen the Nuns on the Bus? They're about to take off on a tour of the country again. The network was started by 47 nuns from 26 religious communities about 50 years ago, and they have been a lobby on the Hill for all that time, particularly looking at economic issues and trying to square up Catholic social teaching with votes in Congress. And one of those women at a party suggested that what we needed was something like Network, that is a collective effort, but for women in religion, not to lobby, but for women in religion. So in 1983, Protestant, Jewish, and later Muslim women, not to mention Catholic women, were in abundance trying to find their ways in our respective traditions. Everybody was doing it. We were also trying to find overlaps and crossovers in ecumenical and interreligious circles. So we didn't want to replicate the religious silos in which we had been trained, but we wanted to build new religious models. And I think, Kate, that goes to your question, that was from the very beginning of this work in feminist theology. None of it was seamless, but we lacked what Water has become, namely a networking organization for the cutting edge academic work in the field, for the on-the-ground ministry work, and for organizing when needed, and of course, responding to the daily lives of people whose own religious traditions do not provide resources, or who are now part of the growing cohort of nuns, not our NUNS, but NONES, people who have no religious traditional affiliation, or my favorites, the never agains. I mean, not only are they done with it, they don't want to be part of their tradition, but they don't want to do it again. Still, these dear people's babies die, their mothers get sick, and their cats get stuck in trees. And they have the same, in my view, human right to spiritual care. Water continues to be a place that does that now. We're very small staff, small set of offices, but we like to say we make a lot of trouble on a little money. That's really who I am and where I come from. And if you want, we can stop for a bit, or I can go ahead and talk about kind of a broad overview of the field and how I think it's grown in my 50 years of participation, and then pick up with your questions. Is that?
I think you can keep going, Mary. We're used to.
Is it clear? So you're getting what I'm trying to say? And
I think so.
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay, good. I hope it's what you're looking for. I don't want to.
This is great background. I think you're just starting to talk about your organization, about Water. I want to make sure I didn't miss.
No, you didn't miss that at all.
Okay,
I'm
great.
going to come back to that at the end, actually.
Cool.
I think it's more important not what we do, but what's going on, you know, so the big picture that we're all a part
Absolutely.
of.
This
So
is
let
great.
me turn to the third part of what I want to say, which is the kind of broadest overview of how the field, I think, has grown in 50 years. And I want to look primarily at Christian resources for sake of time, not because they're the most important, but we could replicate this list and these issues, these ideas, with looking at primary resources in other traditions as well. But I'm going to confine myself to what I know best. Let me start with the fact that when we talk about feminist theology, the earliest work in English and in the Christian tradition can be traced to the 1890s, really. The Women's Bible, which was a publication by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And of course, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a great part of the suffrage movement. And in 1895, the Woman's Bible by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her revising committee came out. And it was a commentary on verses of the Bible that had to do with women. It is not a great work of theology, but it's an important document to look at because it makes the political connection between religion and suffrage. Even to the consternation then of suffrage leaders who felt that maybe the vote would be lost if people were this kind of critical of religion. You know, maybe they would lose the vote. Well, they didn't have the vote to lose, so that was rather useless. But the reality is that what went on was not women scholars got together. In fact, the best scholars of the day wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. It was women, like most of us, who are not trained as theologians, but who got together. And some of these stories are apocryphal, but I love this one too, that they each had 2 copies of the Bible and a pair of scissors. And what they did was they kept one copy of the Bible intact, and the other copy, they cut out those verses of the Bible that had to do with women. And then they were dealt out to the various members of the so-called revising committee. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her 26 friends went home and wrote their own exegeses of these various biblical verses. And they put it together in the Woman's Bible. And it was a challenge, a deep challenge, to the fact that they had not been able to express their theological views before, and now they could. And they did it out of a political commitment, not simply out of a religious commitment. And I think that political connection is a thread that runs through feminist theology across the board. The next important thing that happened was in 1960 when a professor at Hobart William Smith College, Valerie Saving Goldstein, wrote an article called The Human Situation, A Feminine View. The Human Situation, A Feminine View. It was published in 1960 in the Journal of Religion. And she said that men and women have differences when it comes to sin. Men's sins, she said, are mostly about power, taking up a lot of space. Whereas women's sins are almost the opposite, not taking ourselves seriously, not taking other women seriously, doing too much at once, what we now call multitasking to make it sound good. But, you know, you're diapering the baby and cooking dinner and ironing a blouse at the same time. Yeah. And she said, this is not going to work. And then she said, the problem is, if you look at, especially in the Christian tradition, how women are taught to be, love your enemies, be good to those who hate you, cover your heads, turn the other cheek. This could be very dangerous news. This could be a very dangerous message to women who are already oppressed. It could be very helpful to, or perhaps salvific even for men. But she said, it's not that women don't sin. It's just that the sins are almost the opposite. And the tradition is, the teachings are set up as if it were only men. So she called this into question, the human situation, she said, a feminine view. I always say that she, might have put that little warning like on cigarette packages, this book could be dangerous for every woman's health. But I think it really, again, helped to say that religion is a gendered activity. And whether you think women sin or not, there's some question about that, there's a gender difference, there's a class difference, there's a race difference. All these things that came later were based on the notion that we understood there was a gendered nature to religion. There's also a racialized nature to religion. There's so all of these things that are now part of our intersectional analysis began with these writings. I mentioned Mary Daly earlier. Before she wrote Beyond God the Father, she wrote a book called The Church and the Second Sex, a refinement of Simone de Beauvoir's work focused on religion. But as Catholic women were quick to find out, and she wrote this in the late 60s, right after the Second Vatican Council. And by the way, Mary Daly only had 3 doctorates, but 3 doctorates. One from here in the States, from St. Mary's College at Notre Dame, which was euphemistically and derisively referred to as the ladies' degree. It was the only place women in the 60s Catholic women could study theology, St. Mary's at Notre Dame, under the direction of Sister Madaleva, who was a brilliant educator. But Mary Daly did her doctorate in the ladies' degree at St. Mary's at Notre Dame. Then she went to Fribourg in Switzerland, and she did 2 doctorates, one in philosophy and one in theology in Fribourg, most of which classes were in Latin. So no slouch, Mary Daly. But she wrote this book having spent some time at the Second Vatican Council. And remember, that went from in the mid 60s, 3 or 4 years of the bishops meeting. And there were women who observed. She wasn't even one of those. She just hung out. In fact, her mother was visiting her in Fribourg, and she sent her mother a postcard. Remember postcards? There was no phone or email or fax or, 2 orange juice cans and a string, I suppose. The poor mother was in Fribourg waiting for her. Dear mom, I'm not coming home on Friday the 14th, whatever I planned. Don't worry, I'm having a great time at the council hanging out with journalists. And that was Mary Daly's experience of watching these, what she called the processions of these men all dolled up, and they didn't even know what was going on because most of them couldn't read Latin. They had friends or colleagues who at the night during the council would translate the Latin that had gone on all day and give them a little précis of what had happened, and then they'd go in and vote. So Mary Daly became rather dissatisfied by the quality of the leadership in the Catholic community, shall we say nicely. And she wrote the Church in the Second Sex and said, it's got to change. Well, as we were quick to find out, change was not in the offing, and it was arguable whether and how much women as ministers really have changed the structure and substance of other religious traditions as well. And I say that quite frankly. Has it really changed a lot? But that might be for another day or for at least later today. Most significant, I think, all of this work that I've talked about was by white women, but it was women of color, especially Black women, who challenged white women, and they challenged Black men. The late, great Katie Geneva Cannon was one of the people who started womanist theology, not feminist, but womanist theology, taking the term from Alice Walker and always saying that womanist was to feminist as purple is to lavender. And that was the beginning of a theology based not on rights, as white women insisted, but on the survival of women and our dependent children, as well as the survival of the whole community, especially including Black men. And I think this most significant change for us in feminist theology was that anti-racism then, and economic analysis, became part of the work of feminist theology. There was no turning back. So we are indebted to and now led by and learning from women of color whose emphasis is on justice, not simply equality or even equity. They changed the whole field. The best example of that is in the reproductive choice arena, where Black women came along and said, no, it's not reproductive choice we want. It's reproductive justice. And what did they mean by that? By that, they meant women should have the right to have no children at all, to have as many children as they wish, and to raise those they have with access to food, education, housing, and jobs. And that's the work of Loretta Ross, who's one of the great leaders of the reproductive justice movement. And that, ironically, would have made it very easy for Catholics to have a pro-choice position, and of course, most of us do. But what has unfolded as decades of women's religious leadership has emerged, for example, in the Catholic group, we have Catholics for Choice, but what's emerged in almost every religious group is a group working on hot button issues, especially LGBTQ2S groups in virtually every religious group. Now, there are serious cases of backlash against these so-called gains. Catholics, for example, don't even have altar girls in many places, much less women priests or bishops. Baptists and Southern Baptists have been so recalcitrant on women that Jimmy Carter left. Still, brilliant women leaders like Episcopal Bishops Barbara Harris and Jane Holmes Dixon, Lutheran women, Methodist, United Church of Christ, Unitarian Universalist women, too numerous to mention, lead what are now generally shrinking denominations struggling in a diverse religious marketplace. Ironically, religion, at least in mainline churches, white churches, seems to be heading in the direction of becoming a zone of women. We'll see. Imagine, for example, when Catholic women are ordained, they will be charged with cleaning up the clergy's sexual abuse mess, funding a denomination in serious financial trouble, and attending to the pastoral needs of a shrinking but still needy group of people. So it is. So I think it's a mixed blessing, what's going on, and I think it's happening in the Protestant churches as well. As women ascend into the ministerial ranks, many of the denominations, for perhaps related reasons I can't say, are also shrinking in terms of their numbers. So there's a very interesting dynamic going on, but there's a lot of cleanup that is being done, and a lot of especially financial problems that, during the flush times when men were in charge of most of these churches, it was one thing. Now it's a little more difficult, I'd have to say. But other changes have really had as much effect on this as gender. One is technology. It has revolutionized the study of religion, and now post-COVID with Zoom, religious practice is revolutionized. Many people who went to Zoom for worship have never gone back to their places of worship again. I don't think this is a bad thing. We can talk about that, but I don't think that's altogether a bad thing. Much as I love in person being with people, would love to be with you. Yes, I'll come over some weekend from Saratoga, but this isn't a bad option. And on water programs, there's often somebody from Australia, where it's 14 hours time difference, somebody from Germany. So technology has revolutionized things, and women have really gone with the flow on this. The second thing, and I mentioned it earlier, these are four basic changes I want to talk about, is the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Market share in most mainline religious denominations has dropped like a stone. Remember, Catholics would go to hell if they didn't go to Mass. Well, now fewer than 30% go to Mass regularly. Interestingly, and most recently, I have learned that college-educated young men are more likely than college-educated young women to be observant Catholics, which means that issues like abortion, equal treatment, etc., are personal to women while they're more theoretical for men. It's okay now not to be religious. If it's bad for your health to be religious, or if it's boring, or if it's otherwise offensive, it's okay. It's socially okay. And some of these people call themselves never again, meaning they have no further interest in religion. I say, fine, I'm not big on football. I'm not into sports betting. There are lots of different ways people are in the world. And I think we have to really have an openness to what it is they have to teach us, and particularly to take seriously the things that they critique. And I take this very seriously, that young men are more tolerant of patriarchal Catholicism than young women. That tells me something I'm delighted to have been a part of creating. The third thing that's different, I think, is the global reach. Women around the world are in communication. Seeing things like violence against women, especially domestic violence, rape, genital cutting, as issues that have religious roots and religious support. A good woman stays with her husband no matter what. This has been very helpful to see this in a big picture. So it's not just my religion I'm looking at, but it's our ways of being religious, or more today, being spiritual. And I think that global reach has been an enormously shaping factor for most of us in the field. And finally, I would say the role of religion in climate change is something to look at very carefully as a bellwether. Eco-feminist work showed Earth was treated like a woman. Susan Griffin's book, if you remember it, Woman and Nature, The Roaring Inside Her, came out in 1978. Did anybody read that? I thought it was one of the great books. Women and Nature, The Roaring Inside Her. And now we see the generational impact of what Susan Griffin was talking about in terms of the rape of the earth and the pillaging of species and so forth. And I think we're beginning to see the generational impact of that. More people are seeing it. And we're seeing religions trying to be helpful. Even Pope Francis, for whom I don't have a lot of very positive things to say, his Laudato Si is a very helpful encyclical, despite the fact that it is absolutely horrendous in terms of birth control and abortion, which are certainly factors in the ecological discussion. So, but the encyclical itself has some very helpful teachings around technology and the use of resources And it is very much a way of
I agree.
saying how U.S. people and other from developing countries have caused most of the problems that we find ourselves faced with. So let me conclude by saying where I think we're headed, and then we'll just open this up for a good free-for-all discussion. I have to confess my crystal ball is out of power, but I will hazard to suggest 3 future directions I see emerging, at least in the near term. And in religion, when we say the near term, we mean at least 50 years. Sometimes it means the near term is 100 years. But anyway, in the near term, a few of us on this call will see these changes, but I think we can all have make a claim to have somehow had a role in shaping them. First, I think being religious will be more eclectic than parochial. I think we will be more interreligious and spiritual than denominational in the future. I think this is just the way it's going. I find many people are already living hybrid religiosity. Look at Kamala Harris with Indian and Jamaican roots, with Hindu as well as Christian influences on her sense of how the world works, what's good, how to live well as a responsible person. It'll be interesting to see what document she lays her hand on in January. Many people live with such hybridity. Jewish and Christian marriages, when I was a child, were unheard of, but so were Irish and German unions. Those were the, Irish Catholics marrying German Catholics, or Polish Catholics marrying Italian Catholics. Who did that? And so Jewish Christian marriages now are something that we have come to understand. People choose. And I know that there are attendant problems on both sides of that equation, but there also now are, at least here in my Washington, D.C. area, groups of people who on Sunday morning get together with their Jewish and Christian families and are bringing their children up to respect and to love and to experience and to live with a foot in each tradition. And again, it's not ideal for everyone, but it's something that gives us a hint or a glimpse of how good people are trying to live their lives. And I want to honor that. I also think agnostics abound. And so many of us have agnostic views on many issues, even if we're card-carrying Protestants or Jews who are enrolled in a synagogue. We may be agnostic on certain topics, and I don't think that's a bad thing either. Buddhism has given us meditative practices that are so key to the spirituality of so many of us. We don't think of ourselves as Buddhist as such, but by golly, we use those techniques in our meditation. I think the examples of this kind of these eclectic ways of being religion are endless, but the common thing here is that the common thread is that we learn and imbibe, we appreciate and reject aspects of many religious traditions now that we're exposed to them. Something most of our grandparents simply were not. My grandparents were taught, don't walk into a Protestant church. Walk across the street if there's a Protestant. No, they didn't have any idea. As the great Professor Diana Eck at Harvard Divinity School, a religious pluralism leader, has said, we used to say that to know one religion was to know all religion. But now we say to know one religion is to know no religion at all. I think she's right. A second future that I see is that being human used to be more deeply gendered than I think it will be in the future, when there were only 2 options in the past, male and female. But with the rise of non-binary, trans, and other options, the carefully constructed and protected religious tropes and lots of other things can fall away. For example, in the Christian tradition, progressive feminists in the 70s looked to the Galatians 3:28 passage, there's neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female, to support the inclusion of all, especially women. But now, more recently, this has been read literally by Virginia Ramey Mollenkott and other trans advocates to mean we're all somewhere on a gender spectrum. All bets are off. This is a quick shift. They really read it and say, there's no male or female. Well, all right. That's a quick shift in 50 years. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that this will change the Vatican's mind on women priests, but I think it helps us to think anew about what it means to insist on distinctions between clergy and laity, for example. Why do we need those? In other words, from the discrimination against women, we don't need to repeat old patterns that might simply put some women in the position of discriminating against others. The sky's the limit on how we reconfigure many things in light of the insights about women. What's at stake is a whole way of thinking beyond the hierarchical dualisms that Rosemary Ruther talked about. Rosemary Ruther, the great theologian, said the real problem is that we see everything not just in binary terms, but one's always got to be better than the other. The legal scholar, it's true, right? The legal scholar Catherine McKinnon noted there is no difference I can think of without distinctions or without discrimination. For example, this is my favorite example is carrots and chocolate. Which would you want for Valentine's Day, carrots or chocolate? We discriminate between foods. They're not just different. We think some of them are more romantic, more delicious, more everything than others. Until and unless we can reconfigure our thinking, or what St. Thomas Aquinas called our habit of thinking, to see many options as good if different, we're going to still perpetuate the hierarchical dualisms that oppress, whether it's God, world, clergy, laity, men, women, straight, queer, however it's going to play out, until that way of thinking is rounded, we're going to have the same problems. And finally, I think the human imagination and creativity are very powerful tools. And I think this is where we're going in the future. But they're powerful tools that can be used in myriad ways, human imagination and creativity, especially at our level of technology. They can be dangerous. The explosive pagers in Lebanon this week are one example of technology at work.
Oh, terrible.
God forgive us.
Yeah.
But in the same echelon of creativity are the brilliant insights of many religious traditions that spark and inspire movements for peace, ways to end war, new ways to live with respect for nature and earth, ways to eradicate sexism and racism and violence, new equitable economic paradigms. These all come from, or at least have some roots in religious traditions. It has always been the work of religion to do this, to look for the new, the better, the more inclusive, the more encompassing. And with necessary correctives around race and gender and the rest, we have, I think, at our disposal what theologian Daniel C. McGuire calls, and I quote him, the renewable moral energy of religion. Every generation, he says, can renew the moral energy of their religion and make it new for new things. And it can be unleashed anew, the renewable moral energy of religion. I love the phrase because it has such an eco feel to it. It's so contemporary. And it is, in fact, how religions can be useful. Again, I'm not so naive as to think that Wall Street is waiting for feminist theologians to ring the bell tomorrow morning. And I don't see too many other sources of inspiration and solidarity that are capable of providing what religious imaginations contribute to a just and equitable world. That's why I do this work as my small part. What's yours?